The world was still moving in its usual rhythm when the first strange signs appeared, but almost no one noticed them. People were so busy with their everyday routines that a small change in the sky meant nothing to them. Most only looked up when they needed to check the weather or admire a sunset. They didn't know something unusual had already begun far beyond what the human eye could see. There was one person who paid attention, though. He worked as a researcher in an old observatory built on top of a quiet hill. His days were simple. He woke up before sunrise, made his weak cup of tea, and sat in front of the radio scanners that listened to space. It wasn't a job many wanted, but he enjoyed the silence. He liked searching for patterns in the noise, even if the rest of the world ignored what he did. One morning, he heard something that made him stop. It was a soft pulse, faint and uneven, almost like a heartbeat that didn't belong. He listened again. The pulse repeated, then vanished. The sound confused him. It wasn't the usual cosmic noise he had spent years listening to. It wasn't a star's flicker or a broken signal from a satellite. It was something else, something he had never heard before. He recorded the pulse and waited to see if it would return. For hours, the scanner stayed quiet. Then the pulse came again, this time a little stronger, a little clearer. It felt like something was trying to speak, but the message was buried under the weight of distance. The researcher didn't want to jump to conclusions. He had made mistakes before, thinking he discovered something important when it was only a glitch. Still, his heart felt heavy in a way he couldn't explain. He saved the recordings and studied them again and again. The pulse seemed too organized, too deliberate to be an accident. He contacted a few agencies to report what he found. Most didn't reply. A few responded with short messages that basically said, "We'll look into it," but no one actually followed up. Everyone was too busy dealing with other global issues, storms, political meetings, markets going up and down. A strange sound in space didn't feel urgent to them, but when something is ignored, it doesn't stop existing. It just waits. Over the next several weeks, the pulse changed. It became more frequent, more patterned. The researcher made notes in small notebooks filled with tiny handwriting. He tried to decode it, but the pattern didn't follow any known logic. It didn't match radio signals, language structures, or anything human-made. It wasn't even following the randomness of natural cosmic events. Sometimes he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, wondering if he was worrying for nothing. Maybe he was overthinking. Maybe he should just record it and leave it to someone else. But every time he tried to push the worry away, he felt a cold sensation down his spine. Something deep inside whispered that these signals were not harmless dot around the same time. Something strange happened in a faraway place. Humans had never heard of a place beyond Earth's skies. The Galactic Council, a group of civilizations older than humanity could imagine, also picked up the pulse. They had systems far more advanced than Earth's, and their sensors caught the signal before it even reached the researchers' equipment. Their machines didn't just hear the pulse, they recognized it. Council members, gathered in a large chamber carved from stone and metal, surrounded by screens floating in the air. They looked at the signal and understood its meaning faster than any human could. It wasn't a message. It wasn't communication. It was a warning one the council had prayed they would never hear again. The pulse was the first sign of a cosmic disturbance, the kind that could swallow entire worlds if it arrived without preparation. The council debated what they should do. Some members said they should warn Earth immediately. Others argued that Earth was still too young, too unprepared, and that the disturbance might pass without causing harm. They had seen planets survive such events before, just barely. Maybe Earth would be lucky too. Their debates dragged on. Their fear wasn't Earth itself. It was the rule the council had followed for thousands of years. Never interfere with a world's natural fate unless that world asked for help directly. Earth had never heard of them. Earth never asked, While the council argued, the researcher tried everything to get someone on Earth to listen. He sent emails, reports, audio files, summaries, anything he could think of. A few scientists showed interest at first, but they soon disappeared into meetings and paperwork. News outlets didn't care. Governments didn't have time. People were worried about their own problems, not a distant pulse no one had ever heard about. Still, he kept listening. The pulse changed again. It grew sharper, louder, and now carried a strange vibration that made the radio room shake slightly whenever it played. The researcher leaned closer to his speakers and closed his eyes. When the pulse hit, he felt a pressure behind his ears. Like it wasn't just a sound anymore, but something pressing into the world. He tried recording it with different equipment, but each time the data files came out corrupted. It was as if the signal didn't want to be captured. He wondered if he should go public with what he knew, maybe post it online, but he feared people would laugh at him or accuse him of making things up. This wasn't the kind of story people believed easily. He spent more nights in the observatory, barely sleeping, eating simple food he brought with him, because he didn't want to leave the equipment alone. He felt responsible, even though he didn't know why. He simply couldn't ignore the feeling that something important was happening. One night, when the skies were especially clear and the room felt colder than usual, the pulse returned with a rhythm so strong it made the windows vibrate. The researcher stood up from his chair and pressed both hands against the table. His breath trembled. The sound felt heavier, like a warning turning into a countdown. He stared at the screen, watching the lines spike up and down in perfect, unnatural harmony. His heart raced, and for the first time since it began, he wasn't just confused or curious, he was scared. He whispered a few words to himself, not loud enough for anyone to hear, but enough to keep the fear from breaking him. This isn't normal. Something's coming. He didn't know what. He didn't know when. But he knew the world wasn't listening, and he knew he didn't have the power to stop whatever was approaching that far beyond Earth. The Galactic Council continued its debate. They reviewed Earth's history, its struggles, its progress. Some argued that humans deserved a chance to survive. Others said interfering would break the rules and lead to consequences for the Council itself. They delayed the decision. While the pulse grew stronger, the world below stayed peaceful, unaware of the danger moving toward it. People woke up, went to work, laughed, argued, planned their futures. Anyone who looked at the sky saw nothing unusual. The blue stayed blue. The stars stayed steady. There was no sign that anything was wrong. But in the researcher's observatory, the air felt heavy and restless. He sat in the dim yellow light of his desk lamp, flipping through pages of notes full of worried scribbles. He tried once more to reach someone important, someone with authority, someone who could make the world pay attention. But the message got lost, buried under other priorities. He leaned back in his chair, exhausted, and listened to the quiet room. The pulse had stopped again, leaving only silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. It felt like a breath held too long. He looked at the sky through the window. A faint glow traced the edges of space, a glow he had never noticed before. It wasn't bright, but it pulsed faintly, almost in sync with the signal he had been hearing. He wondered if anyone else in the world saw it, or if they had already gone to bed, unaware of the story unfolding above their heads. He didn't know that while he stared at the sky, the Galactic Council was nearing its final decision. He didn't know that they were already too late. He only knew that something was coming, and the world wasn't prepared. The world woke up the next morning just like any other day. People stretched, yawned, checked their phones, scrolled through news that never mentioned anything about the strange pulse in space. Cars moved through busy streets, shops opened, children hurried to schools, and adults hurried to work. Life felt normal, calm, ordinary, But the researcher at the small observatory didn't feel calm at all. He hadn't slept properly in days. His eyes were tired, his hands shaky, and his mind kept replaying the sound of the pulse. Every time he closed his eyes, he could still hear that strange beat echoing, somewhere deep inside his thoughts. He tried to convince himself he was overthinking, but every instinct told him he wasn't. Something had changed in the pattern. He knew it. He could feel it. The world may not have noticed, but he did. Late in the afternoon, he turned on all the scanners again. The machines hummed softly, filling the quiet room with a faint mechanical warmth. He leaned forward, staring at the monitors. He kept waiting for the pulse to return, hoping it wouldn't, but fearing it would. Minutes passed. Nothing. And hours passed. Still nothing. Part of him was relieved. Maybe the disturbance had ended. Maybe the universe had simply flickered for a moment and returned to peace. But the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the pause before something heavy drops. Meanwhile, far beyond Earth's sky, the galactic council chamber was crowded again. Screens hovered in the air, displaying readings of the disturbance. The signal had vanished suddenly, and the council members were trying to understand what that meant. Was the threat gone? Or was it closer? Many argued that Earth was too unprepared to handle a cosmic event. Some insisted the council should send a warning immediately, even if it meant breaking their old rule against interfering without invitation. Others were still unsure, still debating, still worrying about consequences. And every moment they argued, the universe moved forward without waiting for their decision. That night, something unusual happened on Earth. It began quietly. First, a weather satellite stopped sending information. At first, technicians assumed it was a technical fault and tried rebooting it. But the reboot system didn't respond. They tried again. Nothing. Within an hour, a second satellite went silent. Then a third. At first, no one panicked. Satellites fail sometimes. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of. Experts assumed they were dealing with an unlucky coincidence. But coincidences don't usually happen in groups of 3. Back at the observatory, the researcher received an email from a colleague at a communications center. The message was short. Are your systems working? We're having strange problems on our end. The researcher typed back quickly, explaining the situation. Then he tried calling the center, but the call didn't connect. He hung up, tried again, and still got no response. His stomach tightened. He pressed the button to check the observatory's external radio receivers. Everything inside looked fine, but the outside signal was weaker than usual. He ran his hand over the controls and adjusted the frequencies. Still weak. Something was interfering with them. He stepped outside for a moment to look at the sky. It looked normal, clear, calm. Stars blinked faintly like they always did. Nothing looked wrong, but the silence felt wrong. As he stood beneath the sky, he heard a faint rumble in the distance, not from the ground, but from somewhere above. It was so soft he almost thought he imagined it. But then it came again, slightly louder, like a whisper moving through the clouds, even though the sky was clear. He rushed back inside and checked the scanners again. A faint pattern appeared for a moment, thin, jagged lines jumping weakly on the screen. They weren't forming the pulse, not like before. These lines looked broken, disturbed, as if the signal was being interrupted by something much larger. Then the entire screen flickered. For a moment everything went completely dark. He froze. Then the lights blinked back on. The scanner beeped repeatedly. Confused by whatever had just happened, he stared at the screen, breathing hard. He tried to contact a senior scientist he had worked with before, someone he trusted, but the call didn't connect. He used his backup device, but it also failed. The internet in the observatory slowed to a crawl, then cut off completely. He switched to the emergency radio channel, and scanned for any communication. All he heard was static. He stood there in the dimly lit room, listening to the static crackling through the speakers, and felt the cold truth settle inside him. This wasn't just a technical glitch. Something was affecting the entire planet. He took a deep breath and told himself not to panic. Panic never solves anything. He reached for his notebook and started writing everything down. The satellite failures, the weak signals, the disappearance of the pulse, the flicker in the scanners. He needed a clear record, something that could make sense. Later. Hours passed slowly as he kept listening to the static. Then, just as he started to doubt himself, something new appeared on the screen. The lines shifted, twisted, and formed a single sharp spike that shot upward like a warning flare. He leaned forward, afraid to blink. Another spike followed. Then another. But they weren't rhythmic like the first pulse. They were chaotic, scattered, almost trembling. He adjusted the frequency. The spikes grew louder, clearer, but they still didn't form a pattern he recognized. It almost looked like interference, but from something massive, something powerful enough to bend signals across space. He checked the observatory's power supply. It was dropping slightly, not enough for a shutdown, but enough to make him worry. He checked again a minute later, and it had dropped a little more. Something was draining energy everywhere. Far above. The Galactic Council, still deep in its debate, finally realized they could not waste more time. Their sensors picked up massive fluctuations around Earth's orbit. They knew what those fluctuations meant. The disturbance wasn't approaching anymore. It was already touching the edge of Earth's protective shield. They rushed to organize a strike team. Ships prepared to launch defense systems. But even as they moved quickly, they knew they were late. Interference waves had already reached Earth. Back on the ground, the researcher grabbed his phone and ran outside again. The air felt thick and strangely heavy. It wasn't dangerous, just unsettling. He looked up at the sky and noticed something different. The stars flickered more than usual. Not the gentle twinkle caused by the atmosphere, but a glitch-like flicker, almost as if someone was switching them on and off behind a dark curtain. Then he noticed the moon. It looked normal at first glance, but when he stared at it closely, he saw a faint haze around it, like a thin veil that didn't belong there. His breath caught in his throat. He whispered quietly to himself, "This isn't the sky I know." He wasn't a dramatic person. He didn't jump to conclusions. But the world suddenly felt unfamiliar, as if something had shifted out of place when no one was watching. He pulled out a small device he carried for emergency sky readings and pointed it upward. The device beeped softly, scanning the atmosphere. When it finished, he looked at the numbers and his eyes widened. The readings didn't make sense. The upper layers of the atmosphere were experiencing tiny waves of pressure that shouldn't be possible without extreme weather. But the sky was perfectly clear. He knew then, without any doubt, that something from space was interacting with Earth. He hurried back inside and tried the emergency communication line again. This time, he got a response. Not words, not a voice, but a strange sound. Like a faint hum moving in loops. It didn't sound human. He swallowed hard and ended the transmission. He tried contacting a local weather station. No response. He tried the National Space Agency hotline. Also silent. He tried calling a friend who lived in the city. The call connected for half a second, then cut off. He stared at his phone and whispered, "What is happening?" The observatory lights flickered again, but stayed on. He sat down slowly, feeling a strange mix of fear and clarity. He didn't know what the future hours would bring, but he understood something important. Earth had already entered the beginning of an event no one had prepared for. The world outside still looked normal. People in the cities were probably laughing in cafes, eating dinner, watching shows, or scrolling through their phones. They didn't feel the quiet shift the researcher felt. They didn't sense the tension humming beneath the sky. They didn't know the satellites were failing one by one. They didn't know the signals were breaking apart in space. They didn't know the Galactic Council was finally moving, but far too late. The researcher stood up from his chair and pressed his palm against the cold window. He stared at the sky, feeling a deep ache in his chest. For the first time, he whispered the fear he had been trying to avoid since the beginning. I think something big is coming, and I don't think we can stop it. He didn't know that soon Earth would fall completely silent, but the first signs of that silence were already spreading. The next day began in a strange, uneasy way. The sun rose like always, but its light felt different, slightly dimmer, as if the sky had turned into a thin layer of tinted glass. Most people didn't notice. They were too busy with morning routines, rushing to work, making breakfast, complaining about being late. Life continued the way it always had. On the surface, everything looked normal. But under that surface, something was already breaking. The researcher at the observatory had barely slept. He kept checking the scanners again and again. The machines behaved strangely, as if they were struggling to read the signals coming through the atmosphere. Sometimes they worked perfectly, then suddenly froze for a moment before returning to normal. It was like they were trying to read a story that kept fading in and out of existence. He rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the monitors one more time. The lines on the screen looked restless, constantly shifting in small spikes. Not huge ones like before, but tiny tremors, like the universe itself was whispering something he didn't fully understand. He whispered to himself, why didn't they listen? He didn't know who he was blaming. Maybe the agencies he had contacted. Maybe the global leaders who dismissed his reports. Maybe the scientists who didn't take the signals seriously enough. Or maybe himself, for not pushing harder, for not shouting louder, for not making the world see what he saw. He went outside to get some fresh air. The observatory sat on a quiet hill, surrounded by trees and long fields. Usually the place calmed him, but today the silence felt different, heavier. The early morning breeze was still, almost too still. Birds usually chirped at this hour, but today he heard none. He frowned and waited. Still nothing. The trees didn't even move. It was as if the world was holding its breath. He walked toward the edge of the hill and looked at the city in the distance. Cars moved normally. Smoke rose from factories. People probably sat in cafes, scrolling through their phones, unaware that something was slowly swallowing the world piece by piece. Then his phone buzzed weakly in his pocket. He pulled it out quickly. It was a message from a friend who worked at a small local tech center. The message said, "Is your power stable? Ours keeps blinking." He tried calling back. The call didn't go through. He tried again. Nothing. He went back inside and sat in front of the main scanner, adjusting the frequency again. The moment he turned the dial slightly, the entire system made a low humming noise, like it was struggling. The lights dimmed for a second. He froze. Then the scanner flashed with sudden energy. Lines on the screen jumped sharply, creating a chaotic pattern that lasted only a few seconds before dropping again. He leaned closer, studying the shape of the jumps. They weren't random. They weren't meaningless. They were too sharp, too deliberate. They almost looked like the pulse he had been tracking, but distorted, broken, like a final warning that arrived too late. He wrote everything down in his notebook, filling page after page with shaky handwriting. His hand moved quickly, almost desperately. Something inside him told him that soon writing wouldn't be possible anymore. Far above Earth, in the deep corners of space, the Galactic Council's ships were finally preparing to move. Inside the council chamber, the atmosphere was tense. Members stared at the disturbance maps, showing Earth's orbit flickering with unstable waves. The colors on the screens were shifting blue to yellow, yellow to orange, orange to red. Red meant danger. Red meant the event had crossed the point where waiting was acceptable. One of the council's senior members stood and addressed the others. His voice echoed through the wide chamber as he explained the reality. The disturbance is already inside the system. If we don't move now, the planet will experience a total collapse of communication and power systems. There was no more debate, no more hesitation. After hours of arguments, calculations, fears, and ancient rules blocking their decisions, they finally agreed to act. A strike fleet would leave immediately with defensive systems meant to stabilize an affected world. But deep inside, every member knew the truth. They were too late. The event was already happening on Earth. The fleet launched anyway. Rows of silent ships glided out into space, each one humming with energy. Their engines glowed faintly as they pushed toward the Sol system. But space was vast, and even the fastest ships couldn't reach Earth quickly enough to undo what was unfolding. Back on Earth, the researcher felt the first real sign of the event. The lights in the observatory flickered again, longer this time. Not just a quick blink, but a slow fade and return, as if the building itself took a deep breath before waking again. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the emergency lights. He felt a chill crawl through his body. He turned back to the scanner and tried, sending one more urgent report to the National Space Agency. But the message didn't send. The internet connection icon blinked, then disappeared completely. He tried the emergency radio again. Static dot. He checked the backup generator in the building. It showed a slow drop in available energy. That never happened before. Backup generators weren't supposed to lose charge unless something drained the energy around them. He walked back to the main room and sat down slowly. For a moment, he rested his forehead on his hands. He wasn't the type to give up, but he felt helpless. He had seen the signs before everyone else. He had tried to warn people. But the world was too busy, too distracted, too confident that nothing could go wrong. And now something was going very wrong. He lifted his head and looked at the window. The sunlight outside flickered faintly, almost like a strobe light. It happened so quickly that anyone who wasn't paying attention wouldn't have noticed. But he noticed. He stood up and went outside again. The air felt heavier than before. He looked at his hands and noticed tiny vibrations, so faint that they almost looked like an illusion. He took a deep breath and felt the same vibration inside his chest. It wasn't painful. It wasn't harmful. But it was unsettling, as if the world was slightly out of sync with itself. He tried turning on his phone's compass feature, but the arrow spun in slow, confused circles. He turned on the flashlight, and it took a full second to light up. His battery percentage dropped from 65% to 12% instantly. He whispered under his breath, "This isn't natural." He didn't know that, at that very moment, in a dozen cities around the world, power grids were flickering. Traffic lights blinked unpredictably. Elevators stopped between floors. People complained about slow internet, weak signals, malfunctioning GPS. To them, it felt like a temporary technical failure, but the researcher knew it wasn't temporary. It was part of the same disturbance he had been tracking. He went back inside to check the radar again. The scanner was struggling, showing only faint lines now, barely strong enough to draw a pattern. He whispered, "Come on. Just one more signal?" And then the signal appeared, not like before, not like the pulse. This one was sharp, heavy, and uneven. It blasted across the screen so strongly that the monitor flickered violently. The sound it made wasn't the familiar hum. It was deeper, almost like a long rumble. The researcher's heart pounded fast. He instinctively stepped back from the machine as the entire observatory trembled slightly, not from the ground, but from something in the atmosphere. The trembling lasted a few seconds, then stopped. The scanner beeped one last time and shut itself off. He stared at it in disbelief. It had never shut down on its own before. He tried turning it back on, but the buttons didn't respond. He checked the other machines. All dead. He checked the lights. They were dimmer now. He checked the main power supply. It was dropping quickly. He felt his throat tighten with fear. He knew what total communication failure looked like. He knew what a complete signal collapse meant. He knew what it meant when machines stopped responding. Earth was no longer just experiencing strange signals. Earth was entering a silent zone. He stepped outside the observatory once more. This time, the sky looked blurry, as if a thin layer of mist hung high above, even though the air around him was clear. The sun looked dull, like someone had placed a faint sheet over it. He closed his eyes and whispered softly, "It's happening." He didn't know exactly what it was. He didn't know what shape the disturbance took or how it moved. He didn't know that the Galactic Council's ships were racing toward Earth, knowing they were too late. He only knew one thing with absolute certainty. Earth was in trouble, and the silence had only just begun. When the small rescue craft drifted through the empty sky above Earth, the man sitting near the window kept his eyes fixed on the pale surface below. He still couldn't believe how quiet everything had become. Even though he had already seen the ground once before, there was something different now. The silence felt deeper, heavier, almost like the planet was holding its breath, waiting for someone to speak first. The craft moved forward slowly, giving him too much time to think. But he stayed focused on the moment, rather than the memories that tried to push themselves into his mind. The ship landed close to the old research facility where he once worked. The landing pads were covered in dust, and the small lights on the edges were faint, as if they were trying to glow but had forgotten how. He stepped out carefully, feeling the strange mix of familiarity and emptiness around him. The air was thin, but still breathable, thanks to the emergency systems the Council had activated months earlier. Each step he took sounded louder than it should have, like the ground was echoing just to remind him he was still alive. Walking through the abandoned hall felt like walking through a dream. Everything was exactly where it had always been, the long hallway, the posters on the walls, even the bench near the entrance. But the life behind these things was gone. He reached the main room and paused. His heart beat slowly but heavily in his chest as he looked around. He let his fingers brush against a broken screen, remembering how many times he had walked through that very spot without even thinking. Now every detail hit him with a strange mixture of pain and responsibility. The Council officer who had accompanied him stayed a few steps behind, giving him space. The officer spoke softly, almost whispering. "We scanned the area earlier. The place is secure. Take your time." The man nodded, but didn't respond. He wasn't ignoring the officer. He simply didn't have the words yet. He continued deeper inside. Part of him already knew what he would find, but he forced himself to keep going. Not because he expected some miracle, but because facing the truth felt necessary now. As he moved through the quiet corridors, small details triggered memories. A chair slightly tilted to one side, a cup still sitting near a desk, a small plant completely dried out. Each item carried a story, and even though the stories were gone now, the emotions they held still clung to the air like shadows. He reached the old communication room. This was where everything had changed months ago. This was where he had tried to transmit warnings to the Council. This was where he had waited for a reply that came too late. He walked toward the central console. The screen was cracked, but the frame was still intact. He touched the edge of it slowly, almost like he was touching a memory rather than an object. His chest tightened. For a moment, He felt the pressure of everything he had held inside. But he didn't cry. Instead, he took a deep breath, letting the cold air steady him. The officer finally stepped forward and stood beside him, but didn't say anything. They both stared at the console. It felt like the room itself was waiting for him to speak first. He finally broke the silence. "I thought I could save them," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I really believed there was still time." His voice wasn't shaking, but it carried a deep tiredness that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The officer placed a hand lightly on his shoulder, not as pity, but as support, a reminder that he wasn't facing this moment alone. "We didn't understand the full threat," the officer said gently. "The council misjudged it. Not because of you. Not because of anything you did wrong." The man closed his eyes briefly. He appreciated the words, but they didn't erase the feeling inside him. He wasn't trying to blame himself. He simply felt the weight of being the last one left to stand in this place. After a moment, he stepped closer to the console and pressed the power button. Surprisingly, the emergency battery still held a faint charge. The screen flickered to life for a few seconds, enough to show a frozen message he had recorded during those final hours. It was only one sentence, but seeing it again made the room feel smaller. "I hope someone hears this before everything goes quiet." The officer watched silently as he stared at the message. The words felt like an echo from another version of him, a version who still believed a response would come in time. Letting the screen fade again, he sighed softly and turned away. They continued through the facility. Outside the large window near the exit, the city beyond stretched out in endless stillness. Buildings stood like statues, roads were empty, and not a single light blinked anywhere. It didn't feel ruined. It simply felt paused, like the entire world had been frozen mid-breath. He stepped outside and walked toward a hill near the facility. He used to eat lunch there on busy days. Now, as he climbed to the top, he could see miles into the distance. The wind brushed gently against him, carrying the earthy smell he had grown up with. Even though the world was silent, it still felt like home. That feeling alone was enough to bring a strange kind of comfort. He sat on the grass. It was dry, but still soft enough to hold his weight. The officer stayed a respectful distance away. The man looked up at the sky, noticing how clear it was. The pale light from the sun made everything look washed out, but it also made the world seem peaceful in a fragile sort of way. He whispered to himself, "It shouldn't have ended like this." He didn't raise his voice, didn't let frustration take over. It was a simple statement, born not from anger, but from the simple fact that accepting reality was harder than imagining how things could have been. The officer approached slowly and spoke in a steady tone. "The council made mistakes, yes, but we also learned. We are going to protect every remaining world now. What happened here will not happen again." The man nodded. "Good," he replied softly. "But that won't change this." "No," the officer admitted. "But it will give meaning to everything you tried to warn us about." That thought settled into his mind. It didn't erase the pain, but it brought a small sense of purpose. Maybe his message hadn't saved Earth, but maybe it could save someone else somewhere far away. And maybe that mattered more than he had realized before. He stood up slowly and looked at the sky again. The world was still. It was quiet, but it wasn't completely gone. The ocean still moved. The wind still flowed. The land still held stories. And he was still here, one person, left to remember everything that had once lived on this planet. The officer approached closer. "We should head back soon. The council wants your report." He nodded again. "Just give me a minute," he said gently. He turned back toward the city and let his eyes trace the silent streets. He didn't try to recreate the past. He didn't try to imagine what might have been different. He simply allowed himself to connect with the world around him, feeling a strange sense of calm grow inside him. He understood now that grief didn't always need noise. Sometimes grief lived in quiet acceptance. After standing there for a while, he finally walked back toward the craft. Before stepping inside, he glanced behind him one last time. He didn't say goodbye aloud. He didn't need to. The farewell lived silently in his heart, carried by the dust, the wind, and the quiet sky above. The hatch closed gently, and the engines hummed to life. As the craft rose into the air, he watched Earth shrink below him. It remained silent, still, and waiting. And as he drifted into the upper atmosphere, he promised himself, not with words, but with determination, that he would tell the truth of what happened. Not to bring blame, but to make sure no other world ever faced this silence again. The craft crossed the clouds and disappeared into the vastness of space, carrying him toward a future he didn't yet understand. But even in that uncertainty, he felt something steady inside him. Not hope, exactly, but something close. Something that felt like a beginning not for Earth, but for him. And the silence of the planet stayed behind, holding its own story, waiting for someone else someday to listen. The craft drifted silently through space, leaving Earth behind. The man looked out of the small window, watching the blue and green planet shrink into the distance. It was still beautiful, even though it had become a silent world. The oceans reflected the light of the sun, the forests looked dark and quiet, and the cities were frozen, untouched, but empty. He felt a strange mix of sadness and wonder. He had never thought he would see the world like this, so alive yet so silent out inside the craft. He thought about everything that had happened. He remembered the first signs, the pulse that no one seemed to notice, the satellites that had failed, the cities that had stopped sending messages, and the quiet streets he had walked through. Each memory was sharp, like a small sting. But he also remembered the efforts, the hours he had spent trying to warn people, the times he had stayed awake listening to signals, the hope he had held on to. Even when it seemed pointless, he turned his head and looked at the officer who had accompanied him. The officer was studying a holographic screen, showing the position of Earth and the surrounding system. Their expression was calm, but the man knew the officer had seen the same emptiness he had. Both of them understood that life on the planet was gone, not because of war or violence, but because of forces beyond their understanding or control. It was quiet, too quiet, and it was permanent. He remembered the message he had recorded in the observatory. He had not expected anyone to hear it, not really. But now, as he looked at the planet, he realized that the words might still carry meaning. They might not save Earth, but they could serve as a warning, a record of what had happened, and a lesson for others. The thought gave him a small sense of purpose in the midst of the overwhelming grief. Maybe what he had done was not enough to save his world, but it might save someone else, somewhere else. The officer finally spoke. "We've scanned the planet. There is no activity, no signs of life. You are right about everything you recorded. Your warnings were accurate. If anyone had acted sooner, things might have been different." The words were gentle, careful, almost formal, but they carried weight. The man nodded slowly. He didn't need the reassurance, but it felt good to hear that someone acknowledged the truth. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of loss. He thought about the families who had once walked the streets, the children who had played in parks, the workers in offices, the laughter in homes that now stood silent. He thought about the countless small moments that made life on Earth so ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. All of it was gone. It made his chest ache, but he didn't turn away from the truth. He faced it because he had to. After a long silence, he opened his eyes and looked back at Earth. He noticed something he had not expected. Even though the planet was silent, it still held beauty. The oceans glimmered, the mountains cast shadows, and the forests stretched across the land like dark blankets. Life may have ended, but the world itself remained, a memory of what once was. That memory was important, he realized. It was a reminder of what life could be, and perhaps a guide for what other worlds might need to do to survive in the future. The officer approached him again. "The council wants you to record everything you've seen and experienced," they said. "Not as a report, not as a warning, but as a story. A record for those who might come after." He nodded. That was something he could do. Even if Earth was gone, the story could live. It could teach others, inspire others, make sure no one else ignored the signs like humanity had. That thought gave him a flicker of hope in the cold emptiness of space. He walked to a small console and activated a recorder. He spoke slowly, carefully, describing the pulse he had first heard, the satellites that had failed, the flickers in the sky, the strange hum in the air, and finally, the silence that had fallen over the planet. He described his walk through the empty cities, the observatory he had once worked in, and the final moments he had spent watching Earth one last time before leaving. His voice was calm, but filled with emotion. Each word carried the weight of what had been lost, but also the importance of what he was trying to preserve. As he recorded, he realized something he had not before. He had survived. He had lived through the end of a world, and now he could carry its story forward. That realization was heavy, but it also gave him a new sense of responsibility. He wasn't just a witness. He was a messenger, and the message mattered. Perhaps somewhere far away, someone would hear it and understand. Perhaps someone would act differently because of it. That thought gave him strength. Hours passed as he continued recording. He described the quiet streets, the still cities, and the frozen moments of everyday life. He spoke of the emotions he had felt: fear, sadness, frustration, and finally acceptance. He spoke of the lessons Earth had taught him, lessons about preparation, about listening, about understanding forces larger than oneself, and about the fragility of life. He spoke of hope, too, not the hope that Earth would survive, but the hope that others could learn from its fate. When he finished, he saved the recording into a secure device designed to survive space travel. The officer took it carefully and nodded. "It will be delivered to every world the Council oversees. Your story will not be forgotten." He felt a small comfort in that. Earth would not be remembered only as a silent planet. It would be remembered as a teacher, as a world that tried, as a world that mattered. The craft continued its journey through space. He sat by the window, watching the stars streak past, thinking about the future. He imagined worlds filled with life, full of people who laughed, worked, and loved, who would never take the safety of their skies for granted. He imagined worlds that would listen to warnings, worlds that would act faster, worlds that would survive because of lessons learned from the loss of Earth. The thought was comforting. It was a promise, though fragile, that life could continue elsewhere. He thought about the idea of silence, how it had felt when he walked through empty streets, how it had felt as he watched the oceans from above, how it had felt when he finally left the planet behind. Silence could be frightening, but it could also be meaningful. It could give time to reflect, to understand, and to remember. That was something he wanted others to carry with them: the importance of paying attention, of learning from quiet moments, of acting before it's too late. Finally, as the craft moved further away from Earth, he allowed himself to rest. Not to forget, not to escape, but to gather strength. The universe was vast, full of unknowns, full of dangers, but also full of possibilities. He had survived one of the greatest losses a person could experience, and he would live to ensure that the lessons were shared. That was his purpose now. He looked at the small device that contained his recording and smiled faintly. It was small, fragile, and simple, but it held the essence of a world that had ended. It held the memories, the warnings, and the stories of billions of lives. Somewhere, sometime, someone would hear it. Somewhere, sometime, it could make a difference. That thought gave him a quiet peace. He gazed at the shrinking planet one last time. It was beautiful, even in silence. It was still a home, even if no one lived there anymore. And he understood finally that Earth's story was not over. It would live on through the words he had recorded, through the lessons it had taught, and through the memories he carried. That was enough to make the journey worthwhile. As the craft drifted into the endless expanse of stars, he felt a sense of calm. He had survived. He had remembered. He had carried the story forward. And even though Earth was silent, its voice would travel far, beyond the reaches of the galaxy, speaking to anyone who was willing to listen. The silence of Earth was no longer just an ending. It was a message, and he was its messenger. The universe stretched endlessly ahead, filled with possibilities, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to hope.